Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, The New Building Gateways. Are we ready for this? Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. We will be recording the webinar today, so for those of you who know of individuals who couldn't get here to see it or want to watch it again, then we will distribute a link for that later. So thank you again for attending. Thank you to everybody who has submitted a question online already with their registration. We've had a phenomenal response, and so this obviously proves that the topic we're covering today is very popular and on point, and hopefully we can cover all those questions that are itching to be answered at the moment. I feel from the size of the response we've had so far, we probably won't get through everybody's questions today. So the intention will be that for those we don't get to answer, we will do a Q&A follow-up after this, and we'll distribute that to all attendees who are all registrants who've applied. And if there's anything more that people need to know arising from that, then please obviously do get in touch with us here, and Holly or myself will be able to field those inquiries with our panel. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Holly, who's going to introduce our panellists today. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks again for joining us all. So on the panel today, we have Neil Hope-Collins. So Neil has worked for the Health and Safety Executive for over 20 years. In his time as an inspector, he has regulated a range of industry sectors, from agriculture to the Ministry of Defence and local authorities via engineering, food, electricity distribution and construction. He is particularly proud to have been instrumental in the first field trials of HSE's management standards for work-related stress and playing a lead role in securing a conviction for corporate manslaughter. He joined the Building Safety Programme in November 2020, where he has been instrumental in developing HSE's new role as a building control authority and takes the lead for operational aspects of the golden thread of building information. So that's Neil here. Next, we have Nick. Nick is a chartered architect and a director at Garnett Netherwood Architects. He has complementing degrees in both structural engineering and project management. On graduating, Nick worked for several years in Hong Kong, gaining experience in high-rise commercial and residential developments. On returning back to the UK, he worked for several larger architectural practices before joining Garnett Netherwood in Leeds. As a practicing architect, Nick has experience in the design and specification of a broad range of buildings, particularly in the residential and refurbishment sectors. Within the practice, he is responsible for the quality assurance and technical detailing of live projects. He also carries out architectural and technical consultancy work and acts as an expert witness in litigation and dispute resolution matters. Then we have James Lavender. James is a chartered engineer and a member of the Institution of Fire Engineers with over 25 years of working within the fire safety industry. James has a Bachelor of Science degree in Forest Products Technology and a Master of Science degree in Building Services Engineering. James started his career undertaking fire resistance and reaction to fire tests at a major testing laboratory. James supported several government-sponsored research projects, including the TF2000 compartment fire and combustible cavities fire testing regimes. Subsequently, James has worked for leading fire engineering consultancies and was the technical director at a multidisciplinary consultancy in London. During his career, James has worked in the United Arab Emirates, was the responsible project manager for key accounts, including a national retailer and a leading London university, where he was responsible for supporting the fire safety arrangements across their respective estates. James also regularly supports the British Standards Institution committees, including the redrafting of the BS 9999, the drafting panel of BS 72736, BS 8644, as well as Fire Safety Hazards 000 Strategic Policy Group. James worked with the Building Regulations Advisory Committee as part of Approved Document B Clarification Working Subgroup 1B1 for Ministry, Housing, Communities and Local Government. That was a mouthful. So I will now pass over to Neil to do a short introduction into the gateways and the implementation plan.
Thank you, Holly. Debs, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. This is an area which is important, and I think we would do well to remember and keep in mind the reason why we're here. Following Grenfell and the tragic occurrences of that evening, there was a review of the legislative regime conducted by Dame Judith Hackett. The inquiry is still ongoing, and that will go through its processes and will come to its own conclusions. But Dame Judith's findings came through fairly quickly and have informed, and recommendations that she'd made have been taken on by government, and those recommendations are now being implemented, first in terms of the Building Safety Act, which is now an act, not a bill, has come into force, and the secondary legislation that is, some of which has come in, some of which is due to be coming in imminently. But I'm going to go through again Dame Judith's main findings to start with, because she did not pull her punches. She was very clear, and her report made out that she'd found there was general ignorance of the regulations and guidance. They were not always read by those who needed to, and when they did, the guidance was misunderstood or misinterpreted. She said that there was indifference, and the primary motivation was to do things as quickly and as cheaply as possible, rather than to deliver quality homes. She said there was a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, and there was ambiguity over where responsibility lay. And she said there was an inadequate regulatory oversight and inadequate enforcement tools. This is damning conclusions, and has led to an act and a draft of secondary legislation to try and rectify these matters and help change the culture in the industry, help the industry move forward. The main change was bringing in, through the Act, a new building safety regulator, and the government chose to house that regulator within the Health and Safety Executive. I believe that's because the Health and Safety Executive has a strong history of pragmatic but effective enforcement and regulation across a number of areas: occupational health and safety, chemicals, asbestos, plant protection products, and so on. And so the HSE was asked to take on this new regulator, and the Dame Judith's recommendations were that a similar sort of goal-setting approach should be taken with the legislation, which actually is in line with the way building regulations are written. The new regulator does have responsibility for safety and standards in the whole of the built environment. It does have and will continue to promote competence across the whole of the building industry, including the regulators as well as the regulated. And the third stream of work is to lead the delivery of a new, more stringent regulatory regime for those buildings 7 stories at 18 metres or higher, 2 residential units, and in the the design and construction phase, hospitals and care homes reaching the same threshold. So what have been called higher risk buildings, HRBs. Of those 3 strands, people seem to be focusing a huge amount on the new regime for HRBs. But we shouldn't forget that the changes that are coming in will be applicable across the whole of the built environment. And there are huge changes to the whole of the Building Act, with the application of new regulatory levers and the duty holder and competency requirements being brought in for the whole of the built environment, not just HRBs. So where have we got to so far? August 2021, Planning Gateway 1 started, and the HSE became a statutory consultee for Town and Country Planning Act decisions in relation to higher risk buildings. That work has been going on already. They speak to matters that are associated with Town and Country Planning Act. But in doing that, because those matters will speak to access for fire brigade for the planning side, but touch upon Part B requirements, there's already been some comment that those comments by that unit might anticipate a future response from the regulator when the new regime comes in place. You have to understand there's two separate bits of legislation, but if you have one regulator that is providing advice, albeit in respect of planning, but touches on Part B requirements, it would not be not unreasonable to say that though you could take conclusions from that as to how the regulator might approach the building control side. We have started the building registration for the in-occupation phase. So building registration was opened, and there are two sets of regulations that deal with that. Firstly, the registration itself, but secondly, the key building information. This is the information that the government requires in order to keep oversight of the whole of the built environment. Those two sets of regulations have come in, and the portals are now open, and existing high-risk buildings have up until the end of September to register. We are working on the assumption at the moment that the secondary legislation needed in order to actually enact the new building control regime for those high-risk buildings, for building work in those high-risk buildings, will be in place to start that regime from the 1st of October 2023. Those regulations have still got to go through due parliamentary process, and we're expecting that process to start imminently, at which point those regulations will come into the public domain, and people like myself working for the programme will be able to be a lot more free about what we say, because clearly at the moment those regulations it's not appropriate to go into too much detail publicly. We'll give you as much information as we can. Those new regulations in relation to the new process were signposted in the consultation documents around the Act, and later in the consultation on the intent of those regulations. And the principles, we believe, will carry on through into the regulations when they become public. The principles are that there will be two main hold points within the process. The first will be at the design stage, where an approval will be required from the building safety regulator before construction work can start. That application will need to have sufficient information to demonstrate that the building, when built, will satisfy the functional requirements. There will then be a construction phase where the project will work with the regulator to ensure that we get to a building completion certificate application stage, where the evidence is ready, is understood, and an application can be made based on the building as it is actually built, and it can be demonstrated that that building does satisfy the functional requirements of the building regulations, and therefore can be issued with a building completion certificate. That certificate will then be needed to register the building before it can be occupied. I'll take a breath now, and I think as an introduction to the new regime, that probably takes us through everything. So I'm happy to move to questions now.
Thanks very much, Matthew. So you obviously have a huge insight as to what is going to be expected once the gateways are introduced. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is expected of the duty holder, their role, responsibilities, and key takeaway or tips that you can give to them?
So I think and we were having the discussion before, and some of these roles, the names have been taken from the construction design and manufacture regulations. The underlying principles about the management arrangements and the need for work to be planned, managed, and monitored are similar. The difference is that the proposals are these new roles, the duty holders. The function of those management arrangements will be to ensure that the building will satisfy the functional requirements of building regulations when it is completed. So the duties on the principal designer will be to ensure that the design work is planned, managed, and monitored, such that the designs are adequate, so that if built, will satisfy the regulations. The regulations will set the principles will say that the principal contractor and all the contractors will have duties to plan, manage, and monitor their work, such that the design they receive from the architect is actually realised in a way such that it still satisfies the functional requirements of the building regulations. In reality, I would hope that this would be happening anyway. I mean, why wouldn't a building be built so that it was legal now? The functional requirements haven't changed. The law has been quite clear. It is the duty of the developer to make sure that their building is legal. None of that has changed. All that will be changing is more rigour, shall we say, about asking those key duty holders, the people who actually, it is within their gift to make sure that that safe building is realised, asking them to articulate what are their management procedures to make sure the work, the design that the architect has done actually will produce a safe building, and what are their procedures to make sure that the contractors are building what was designed in the first place. So I think the underlying principles are relatively simple. The challenge for the industry will be to ask themselves, what are they doing? What are those processes that in a lot of cases, they will have been putting in place anyway? We're just asking them to articulate them and be clear about them sticking to them.
Yeah. Nick, I'll come to you. In terms of, we mentioned the CDM process, and obviously there feels to be a big change now in the way that building control has been managed. Perhaps you can give some reflection on how you feel your role as an architect will fit into the new process, and maybe touch back on how that compares with when the CDM came in.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think just to start with, I think that the role of the architect and the designer, it is going to change. However, saying that, as Neil said, the planning, the managing and the monitoring of the work, most architects are doing that in any case. And a lot of architects that currently take on the lead design role, the multidisciplinary team, working on larger projects, they'll be enacting a lot of these processes in any way now. And I think it's really a case of them formalising these processes more, making sure that they're, the technical performance can be met ultimately, to ensure that their building design does meet building regulations. As far as how it ties in with CDM, CDM is about the building safety as the building's being constructed. Correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, but the BSA, it's about the building safety once complete. So yes, any architect, any designer, and also any architect taking the principal designer role, they will be building on those processes that they've picked up and put into place during the CDM. However, I think the duties are a lot more onerous, and especially with HRBs, there's a lot of competency checks. I know, having been through the RIDA's initial guidance on the gateways and BSA, they're going to be how you improve your competency to be a principal designer is going to change quite a bit, and we've had a bit of discussion about that, and we'll come back onto that later on, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So, James, following on from that, then, are there any concerns that you have or new pressures that you think the duty holder might have to comply with all this? And are there any sort of challenges that you envisage that there might be for you as people place reliance on fire safety advice?
There's going to be new challenges inevitably because it's a new regime. But I think overall, the roles undertaken by the fire engineer within the design team to support the design team to ensure that the building does meet the function objectives, overarchingly don't change. they're working with competent design team members to drive through solutions to provide a reasonable level of health and safety to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations and their functional requirements. I think some of the challenges that we will see is a shift in where the input is required, bringing that effort, that work earlier in the project, mainly towards looking at the Gateway 1, moving through developing a higher level of detail within the submissions to the regulator at that stage, and then moving on to the new Gateway 2, a whole level of detail with an almost packaged solution ready to go into construction. So I think there's going to be challenges there in bringing that level of detail together, and taking that through construction as well, providing that level of support into the latter stages of design where design changes may occur, and taking that to final preoccupation and completion. But overall, I think it's the competent fire engineers have done the role. It's just going to be, they're needed a lot more and at earlier stages and then throughout, rather than being maybe left to the side, as in some cases you might see today.
If I can just come back on that, I think I agree completely. I think what we foresee as the team designing this new system is that responding to some of our conversations with early adopters, with the design trials that we've done, in some parts of the industry, fire engineers have been included at the start with the architects, but then left to the side as a design progresses, so that the fire strategy that was actually designed in the first place by a fire engineer, by the time the building is started, and certainly by the time it's halfway built and finished, the building does not resemble the building that was the basis of the fire strategy. Certainly in those key aspects around the controls and the mitigation if this fire should occur. And I think where this greater rigour in the new regime will become apparent is that expectation that at the Gateway 2 building control approval, there will be a prescribed document required to accompany the application, which will be the fire emergency file, which will set out the fire strategy. And with the expectation, it will be absolutely clear about where that fire strategy will rely upon management arrangements in occupation, that is made absolutely explicit, that information can be passed to the accountable person who's taking the building on. And that's the fire strategy, and that's the design that gets approved. The change control requirements through the construction phase will then mean that if there's anything that undermines that or would change it, that would have to go through rigorous change control processes through construction, which would be reasonable to bring the fire engineer back in and say, yes, does this still comply? So I think you're absolutely right. There'll be more demand, but I think the end result will be that the architect, the design that Nick drew will still end up being realised in the final building. Yeah.
Thank you, Dean. It's all about creating that link, isn't it, from the inception right the way through to what you've got built under fire rescue service, having exactly what was envisioned from the outset. Yeah. Okay. So we touched on the competency, and perhaps Neil, you can tell us a little bit more about the competency declaration as a prescribed document for the building regulations approval.
Absolutely, it will be a pleasure. So the competency declaration, and I think it's an interesting thing for me, because the competency declaration will be one of the prescribed documents that has to accompany the building control approval application, the Gateway 2 application. The requirements in that document are that the client set out the reasonable steps they have taken to assure themselves that their principal designer, their principal contractor, have the right balance of skills, knowledge, experience, and the correct behaviours to work as part of this design team to do the work that's undertaken, that's part of that is their project. And that's it. What reasonable steps did you go through to make sure that the person designing your building was capable of doing it? What reasonable steps did you go through to make sure that the person who builds your building can build the design that you were given? I would hope that that is not beyond what happens already. Because why would you not be taking some reasonable steps to assure yourself that the person you are signing a contract with is capable of doing the job you are giving them a contract for? I think the difference, as Nick has alluded to, is that this will be a document that asks you to actually articulate what those reasonable steps are. And the bit that's maybe a little bit further and pushes that a bit is an acknowledgement that actually you've appointed them. Brilliant. You went through reasonable steps. What are you going to do to make sure that they actually live up to what they told you through their reasonable steps? What are you doing to make sure that that work is managed and monitored all the way through such that the design is realised in the building? Now, again, I would hope that any responsible developer would be doing that. The difference is we will be asking you to articulate how you will be doing that. What will the management arrangements be to actually keep up that? We trusted you to do the job. That meant we thought you had the right skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, competence.
Yeah.
Now prove it to us through your steps.
Not just about, I know, say, for example, the RIBA, I'm sure the RICS as well, are looking at putting together competency registers, but we're saying that's not necessarily going to be the answer to everything. Just,
I think that's part of the package.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you are looking to, if you're looking to have an undertaking that requires some driving, you would look to be taking on drivers. The first step would be, have you got a license? Have you got a bit of paper that says you can drive that vehicle of that class? But the responsible employers out there will normally go further than that and spend some time saying, well, you may have a license, but we've all been in cars with people who've got a license and got out thinking, I'm never going to get in a car without driving again. There is a difference between having a bit of paper and being competent. And responsible employers for a whole range of activities will take a piece of paper, a certain level, as an indication of a level to start with. But then they'll say, how does that individual fit within our team? How does the work that they do work with this project? Because they have a track record, they have a portfolio that says they do have the right knowledge and experience. Let's just dig a little bit deeper than just a bit of paper.
Yeah.
James, do you think there'll be any issues with determining competency in the fire engineering field?
I don't think there'll be difficulties. I think that competency, in terms of, as Neil rightly says, knowledge, skills, experience, behaviour, has always been a fundamental part of fire safety and fire engineering. Within the discipline of fire safety, as within disciplines of architecture and other fields, around the built environment, all of the systems hang together on critical parts, and it's ensuring that those critical parts, either the detail of the design or the implementation of, say, a fire door, or the design of a smoke control system, have been done correctly. And that goes back down to levels of competency, levels of skills, knowledge, etc. I think what is going to be a greater challenge is how is that demonstrated, how is that recorded, and how is that communicated, not only to the project team, so it could be submitted as part of the application process to say this has been developed by these individuals, these are their skills, but also probably to the wider public. A lot of the documents now through the planning portal are public documents, so the public can understand who's been involved in the design process, and setting out levels or methods of communicating that competency. For example, a chartered engineer through the Institution of Fire Engineers could be a good way of demonstrating that they've met the levels of competency within the field of fire safety. It might not necessarily mean that they have knowledge of high-rise residential buildings or, higher risk buildings, because there are such a vast field within the world of fire safety. So it's ensuring that that competency is recorded and is communicated in the correct way. I think another challenge is going to be, though, is that whilst members of the design team may be able to demonstrate competency, we've got to ensure that the regulators and improving authorities have also got the competency to review schemes. And we are going to be on a learning journey with the regulators, with the approving authorities over the next 2 to 5 years. And there's got to be a dialogue there between competent designers and competent reviewers to ensure that the design basis of complex schemes, in my opinion, is understood, is communicated, and is appraised in a way that is respectful of the design that's gone into the system, if that makes sense.
Absolutely does, and almost anticipates the next question. That's a big one.
So,
I will pick that up.
so Neil, so James has obviously mentioned having multidisciplinary teams and having people working on the construction of a multidisciplinary team. Are you going to reflect that in the regulators' approach? Are you going to have multidisciplinary teams? And if so, is there going to be confusion about who does what role?
Yeah, we will be having multidisciplinary teams because we're government and we love TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. We've called it an MDT and tried to pretend it's something new. It isn't at all. These projects are complex. They are large. They require a huge blend of different number of skills and experience and specialist discipline areas. If you're talking about the functional requirements A through to S, you need acoustic engineers, environmental engineers, fire engineers. You need a whole raft of specialists. And the design teams have been working with multiple disciplines within their team, multidisciplinary teams, for years. Honestly, as a regulator, regulators have also been working in the same way. Building control at the moment, a building control officer for a local authority will turn to structural engineers, fire engineers for advice when they're making their judgments on compliance. The health and safety executive on occupational health and safety front will, my 20 plus years as an inspector. I'm a general inspector. I will turn to mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, occupational hygienists to provide the support on those technical areas, and we work as a team. And it's a way of working, particularly from HSE's heritage, is very common in the high hazard industries, where you will have a lead inspector with a team of process engineers, mechanical engineers, specialists looking at those high hazard chemical sites. So this is nothing new. There will be some formality around the way the regulator works it to get over any questions of sort of confusion of authority. I think the difference with this model from the regulator's point of view is the model that we'll be using will be that there will be a lead regulator employed by the building safety regulator at the core of every multidisciplinary team. The other members in that team will have a substantive employer elsewhere, but for the purposes of this project, be brought in under the Act as an authorised officer and be working to the building safety regulator's procedures as an emanation, as part of the regulator for that job. So when you come to working together, absolutely, the multidisciplinary teams, those discipline specialists, will be taken from fire engineers, probably in the first instance those that work for the fire and rescue services, but where there isn't the capacity there going out to other sources, there will always have to be a registered building inspector, because there'll be laws around restricted functions and activities, and it will actually be illegal for the new regulator to make decisions on compliance with building regulations without taking advice from a registered building inspector, because they're the only ones on a regulatory basis who are legally allowed to make those judgments. So every multidisciplinary team for the design and construction phase will have a regulatory lead who is a generalist at the core, who manages and coordinates the work of that team. The team will then comprise a registered building inspector every single time, whose substantive employer may be an approved inspector, registered building control approver, may be a local authority, but for the purposes of that project, they are part of the building safety regulator. It will also include a fire engineer. Will also, at various points, include all the other disciplines that are needed to assist with that decision-making process. I think in terms of the hierarchy, if you will, and the responsibility, the law is quite clear that the advice on compliance with building regulations will need to come from the registered building inspector. So all those other technical disciplines will speak to the registered building inspector. The registered building inspector will be the one that advises the BSR on what a decision might be. And that registered building inspector will be tested, will be challenged to be able to articulate why they think their judgment is true, why they think that building does or does not comply. Because I think one of the main changes in this new regime is we are wanting to move from what currently might be seen in some places as a negative exception regulating. If it's wrong, we'll pick it up. To, within the high risk building regime, a positive affirmative. You tell me why it does comply, and can you articulate that? And I think that will be the main role of those regulatory leads, to challenge the registered building inspector, not to challenge their judgment, but to ask them to be able to articulate the basis for their judgment so that everybody is absolutely clear. If this building is getting approval, we all know why and what elements need to be checked to make sure that it is realised in the building. So that communication with those technical disciplines, they'll come in, work for us for a while, and then be let loose back into the wild again to make money with the contract, and hopefully take those principles with them. So that's where we see the dialogue.
Yeah.
So, Nick and James, then, have you got any projects that are currently working in a similar way to what is going to be envisaged under the scheme? And if so, have you experienced any problems with those developments?
Certainly got experience at the moment of a couple of projects. We've gone through Gateway 1. So far, it's been very positive. We've managed to get through Gateway 1, which was always a bonus. I just see that clearly, obviously, for us, the designers or architects, it's going to be Gateways 2 and 3, I think. I wouldn't really grade on them a slight unknown, particularly sort of waiting for sort of the secondary legislation to come out as well later this year. It's just exactly what all those uses are going to be for Gateway 2 and 3. But in particular for Gateway 2, in how we're going to have to do a lot more of our technical design work at that stage. We haven't gone into that process yet, but we, as a practice, we're getting ourselves prepared for that. It's not so, it's something that we do anyway on projects. So it's just reordering it slightly, doing it more rigorously, making it more formal, getting those processes down. So at the moment, we're getting ready for October, November, when we have got a couple of projects that are going to be entering Gateway 2.
Similar to Nick, I mean, we've had a few projects that are going through, obviously, Gateway 1, so that's in force as we speak. And we're recognising what is going to be needed for when we approach the Gateway 2's stage in the project's life. In terms of teething problems with what we've seen, obviously these are reflective of the current situation in Gateway 1. I think one of the largest teething problems, impact, is what we alluded to before, was the amount of effort and work required, particularly from a fire safety perspective, earlier in the design stage. So what would have been previously quite a simple or less complex report supporting a typical REBA stage 2 design to submit with planning, now completing a fire statement, it needs a significantly greater amount of effort and work to bring all those details together to complete the fire statement and to provide the amount of information to demonstrate to the regulator that the building is safe. And at that stage in the process, a lot of the other disciplines are still lacking behind. So we're trying to strive ahead and asking questions of people which hasn't been designed or even considered yet within the typical REBA stage process. So there's that kind of shift in knowledge and communication which we're going through. That obviously has impacts on fees go up earlier in the design stage when less is committed to a project. And I think the only other teething issue that we see sometimes is engagement with the regulator at the moment. It's not the best relationship, I don't think we would say. Feedback from regulator and the planning authorities is very limited. And I think that's still got to be developed. So consultations that we would typically have with building control bodies, we're not necessarily having with the regulator at earlier design stages. But again, we are on a journey together. The whole industry is on a journey, and we hope that things will improve and develop.
Neil, would you like to pick up on any of those points?
I've been laid a fairly clear challenge there. I'll come back to that one. I mean, I will say now what we're seeing coming through, some of the challenges that are coming to us are, and I'm going to frame the problem and not be able to give too much of a solution because the secondary legislation is not public yet, but people are worried about the transitional arrangements, and I understand that completely. I mean, all like the brackets for the transitionals are going to be, I hope, very clear. We anticipate they won't be changing too much. The new system will come on, the new regime will come on from the 1st of October 2023. If buildings are entered into their building control arrangements before the 1st of October 2023, so full plan submitted or an initial notice in place, then they will either be caught in the transitionals or they will go through under the current regime. The cut-off or whether they get handed over or will carry under the current regime is whether they reach the building will be progressed enough to have reached a new definition for commenced. And this is where I know being unhelpful because I can't tell you what that new definition is. It's been around for consultation, but there has still got to be a decision on it. If the building work has reached the definition of commenced before April the 1st, 2024, then actually that project will carry on under its existing building control arrangements under the existing regime. Couple of little provided caveats with that, where if the arrangements are with an approved inspector, then that approved inspector would have to convert to being a registered building control approver, so that they were actually in line with the new regulated profession requirements. The difficult area for a lot of people will be those projects that are only just starting and will not reach the building commenced point before the 1st of April 2024, and for those, the transitional arrangements that are being worked through, and one of the reasons for the hold up in secondary coming through is this is one of the difficult problems. This is a gnarly thing, and it has taken us quite a while to work through what all the options are, what the different journeys are. But that will become clearer once the secondary comes through. But the principle is that the work will in some way be transferred over to the building control the building safety regulator to take over that building control authority function. Exactly how that looks will depend on the nature of the project and the arrangements they have. That is a challenge for people. I understand that completely. The challenge in terms of buildings and where they're going in terms of their design and the work, we've always said, whether it's the old regime or the new regime, once they're built, they will still have to comply with the in-occupation requirements to adequately assess and manage the building safety risks of fire spread and structural integrity. So regardless of the building control route, the in-occupation will still have exactly the same duties. Those principles have been in the public domain for several years now, and developments ongoing at the moment would be remiss not to take those into account in their building work now. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it. You know where the building's going to go and how it's going to be regulated in occupation. Let's work towards that and be aware of that in the work we're doing. In terms of engagement with the regulator, there have been a lot of comments about the relationship between regulators in under the current regime. There may have been places where that idea of early engagement starts to step over into regulators actually instructing developments what solutions to put in place, and maybe step with the new duty holder requirements, actually stepping on to becoming designers. Yeah. Which is not a place a regulator necessarily wants to be. And there are legal boundaries around that to be clear about where and when that doesn't happen. I think one of the fundamental principles that Dame Judith Hackett was very clear on was that the industry should start to take responsibility for its own decisions and have confidence in that, rather than seeking approval and wanting to know that everything was right before they came and asked for the regulator to sign things off. We are still developing the policy on what any pre-application advice might look like. I think it's reasonably safe to say it will not look like it has done under the current regime. And that's all I can say.
That's right.
Thank you very much for that. So we touched on this earlier when you talked about changes to the Building Act generally. And the Building Safety Act and the current game, since they're focused on these HRBs and obviously the requirements for those, but whether a building is residential or not, it's potentially a high-risk building if it's over 18 metres tall or even over 11 metres tall. Could you see these rules and requirements extending across the wider built environment building control?
I'll use the word could. Yes, I could see that. Honestly, at the moment, we've been doing a lot of stuff in parallel. The timescales for getting the current regime in place have, shall we say, been challenging, to say the least. We've not been thinking about how they might extend or not. So I don't know of any plans to extend the scope of the requirements. I know that when the Act went through the parliamentary process, there were discussions about what scope should look like and whether it should be extended. So I'm aware that those discussions are taking place, have taken place, and will no doubt continue. I think that regardless of whether the law moves to change the scope, and there is provision there for it to do that, the underlying principles are good ones, and why would a developer not take them on board anyway, whatever the scenario?
Designers, why wouldn't they? If they're doing it on a residential project, why would they then not follow it through on a commercial project? As you said, if you put all those processes in place, then you're going to do it, apply it to your whole project.
Why run two systems? Absolutely. And I think to underpin that, the duty holder requirements, those plan, manage, monitor, both for the designers and for the contractors doing the building, that's realising those designs, those duty holder requirements are not just restricted to the high risk building regime. Those are common to the whole of the built environment. And actually, the new enforcement powers for regulators, the stop notices, the compliance notices, the extension in timelines related to being able to pick up work that was maybe substandard later, those again apply to the whole of the built environment, not just the higher risk build, the HRB regime. So the regulators, the local authorities as building control authorities for the work that isn't within the HRB regime, they will have those new regulatory levers available to them. And the duties on all the parties, those roles, will be in place for the whole of the built environment. So I think the things that underpin the new regime are being brought in the law as being common to the built environment. The specifics around the procedures, the greater rigour for the high risk buildings, those principles, once they start to come into play, and as we see specialists, engineers, registered building inspectors, and coming in, working with us, and then going back out again, the hope is there will be that secondary influence on the built environment, and those principles will start to see it become more common.
I think just to kind of add in there as well, and it depends on some of the clients as well. We're working with some social housing providers that tell us no matter what height you want to treat all our projects as HRBs, and it's across the board for them. It's risk averse.
I'm thinking as well, there's the importance of extending the field of competency on that basis. You wouldn't just become specialist in competency for high-rise buildings. As fire engineers, we work on a multitude of different schemes, high-rise buildings, short, flat buildings, for example, that don't present the same risks, retail environments, office accommodation. So having a team around you that can demonstrate that they have the competence, they've got the knowledge about these types of different schemes, the experience, they exhibit the same behaviours of taking on, and not just necessarily meeting what the minimum recommendations are, but applying fire safety engineering to the scheme to demonstrate that the scheme actually meets the building regulations and doesn't just tick up a B box, is a change in mindset that should be across the board, in my opinion.
It goes back to the word, the behaviours, doesn't it?
Yeah,
That change in the behaviours. And once you've instilled the change in the behaviours, then hopefully everybody embraces the regime much easier. So a very popular question on this topic has arisen. The level of building control involvement historically has been discussed in the Grenfell inquiry, and then Julia Packett's report started the ball rolling with the Building Safety Act introduction to address some of the failings in the construction industry across the board. And in the building safety regime, people are keen to know who will assess, what will they be assessing, and who will control the assessors. So I think in terms of who will control the assessors, but certainly in terms of how will this be put into practice on site?
How will it work? So we've talked about these multidisciplinary teams, and there are two things. So I'm going to talk specifically now about the high risk building regime, the HRB regime, where the more stringent, rigorous controls are being brought in for building control. And the mindset will have to change for both the regulators as well as the regulated, because the major changes structurally will be those hold points at the design stage and then the completion stage. And the power of the intent set out in the Act that a building does not start, you can't start the building until the design has been approved. So currently, full plans will be submitted and initial notice will be in place. Fine. But building work can carry on anyway, before that gets approved. And quite often the regulators themselves are playing catch up with the building work. So what they go to see on site, they're almost having to deal with by first principles every time, because they didn't have all the details in the first place, and then stuff has changed since then anyway. The whole intent behind the new system is that the regulator is one step ahead of the designer and the project, so that the design gets approved before you can start. The inspection regime and the relationship through the construction phase is then informed by that approved design. And one of the last stages within what we're hoping to build is that one of the last stages within that approval for the building control approval application will be a schedule, an inspection schedule. And the stages for an inspection schedule on building control process are already known. You talk to any building control professional and they'll tell you, yes, I need to see this, and this at these stages. This is not new stuff, because the functional requirements themselves are not being changed. The difference at this point will be that inspection schedule will be set out at the beginning before the building work starts. The regulator will have the power to set hold points and say, thou shalt not go beyond this until we've seen it. There will be provision to maybe have requirements for the fine detail on some of the designs coming in later. But at that point, there'll be the small fine detail, not the basic, not the overall principles. And there will be you don't start the work until we've actually had a chance to go through the fine detail. So the inspections on site will be are you building what we expected? Are you building what we gave you approval for? Rather than
surprises.
Yeah, absolutely no surprises. Part of it will also be the relationship on site will be your change control log, because the requirements that were set out in the consultation around managing changes on site were really very rigorous. And that was in place to make sure that, again, no surprises. Any change to those documents that were approved at that building control approval application stage will be a controlled change. Any controlled change will have to have a record that says who started it, why, what did they hope to achieve, why will the building still satisfy the functional requirements afterwards? Each piece of advice that they got. From who?
Even the negative.
Even the negative.
Yeah.
And that will be set down in a log. And then your judgment, the client, the developers, PCs, PD's judgment on what's the impact of that change. If the impact would be to fundamentally undermine the approval they were given in the first place, well, that would be a major change and would actually need to go through a whole application process for the change. The rest of the work can continue on site, but you want to do that change, you stop until we've actually approved it. Or you record it, and there's a lovely grey area in the middle that says it might undermine, but we're not sure, and so we'll notify you about it.
So I mean, put simply, if you wanted to change the cavity barrier, and you went to various different manufacturers, but 3 out of 4 manufacturers said that they couldn't meet the requirements, and only one said they could. In that change log, you're going to have it logged there that 3 manufacturers came back saying no and one said yes. So there's going to be a bit of a flag there, isn't it?
There'll be a bit of a flag, I would say, in the first instance, because the responsibility lies with the development, with the PD and the PC and the client to sign it off. The flag is for them to say, are we still comfortable with this change? Can we find something else? Can we do something else? Or are we comfortable that if we go with the 4th supplier, they do satisfy all the requirements? And maybe with the 3, we're going to think this is a notifiable one, and we're going to tell the regulator, and we're going to want them to come and actually give us a little bit of, keep them informed of this. That monitoring the control log, the log of control changes will be something that happens, we would expect at every site visit, because there'll be something that are just recordable, and we want to keep track of those. So it's about making sure that the principle is, we approved a building. Are you building the building that we approved? Which then leads, and the other aspect of that relationship through the construction phase, because you're not working from first principles so much, there should be more scope for part of the application process was, this will be the evidence that we will rely upon when we want to get our building completion certificate. We understand the critical elements that will demonstrate compliance with building regs. We set that out at the front end and say, this is the evidence we want. I would imagine that you might find it useful to talk to your designer or your architect about, this is the bit we need a photo of.
Yeah.
We don't need a photo of the easy bit. We need a photo of the difficult bit that actually shows that this joint was right, that this bit of stocking was right.
Yeah.
So the application first place, part of the construction control plan will be, this is the evidence we will capture. This is when and how we will capture it. So the inspection regime through that will be an ongoing, you should have been collecting this, have you been? We're just keeping that ticking over. The reason for that monitoring of the evidence captured by the development, we ain't catching the evidence, it's your evidence, is so that when that completion certificate application is made, there are no surprises.
Yeah.
And that is all geared towards a nice, easy building completion certificate application, because we all know what the evidence is, because we were with you watching you gather it. We all know that the building is the building we said it would be, because we've been with you along the way. And as I've said it many times now, these are not buildings that get built quickly. I know I have had friends who've met, married and divorced faster than some of the relationship the regulator will have with these developments.
You know, I mean, there's still going to be room to change things. It should be maybe Gateway 2 before that's going to sign up for it. That's not Gateway 2. And, you know, as part of that Gateway 2, you know, definitely you could be doing value engineering work and looking at different products. But ultimately, by the end of it, when you make that application, you've got a scheme of design that is going to satisfy the requirements. And I think this, to me, this really helps with that kind of golden thread of information, that kind of continuation, you know, of the building information that we lose that occasionally now, with how we do things now, where, you know, you might have one firm of architects doing the planning, you might have another set doing a tender, and then if it's design and build, you might have a third set doing a sort of RIBA stages 5 and 6. And for that sort of thread of information to come through all those different design companies and iterations, there's a lot of chances there for it to sort of drop and fall out. But I say, if the designers at stage 2 are get the changes working, you know, hopefully working a lot with the contractors to try and get the costs to where the client's happy, then you know, Gateway 3 should be relatively straightforward.
Let's call it a breeze.
Well, yes, I'm optimistic. Pretty straightforward.
I think you're right. The cooperation and coordination between those duty holders all the way through. There will be provision to make changes through the construction phase as well, because we know those changes will happen. I think the key principle for us is that, and it comes back to actually the inoccupation principle. Do you understand your building? Are you curious about your building? And this is very true through that construction phase. Do you still understand your building and how it works and how it will be realised? And in order to have confidence of that, the first question is, do you as a developer have confidence? Does that mean you understand the changes that are being made through that design, a lot of them legitimately? Do you understand the consequences of those changes? Have you sat down and actually gone, if I change that that affects that over there? Yeah. That doesn't mean you don't do the change, but it means you now realise and maybe have to put some mitigation in over there. Or it may mean you go, we change that, change it. That means we don't do the change. That means we continue with the original design. And it's that deeper understanding and taking responsibility for the actions on site. I think that's absolutely critical for us as a regulator, that take responsibility for your decisions and your actions on site. Understand them, own them.
I think it's crucially important particularly for all disciplines, but for fire safety, as we often look at fire safety in holistic terms for building, and they're changing one aspect. Moving a fire door, you might not think is important, but it could upset or interrupt the ventilation system of the common corridors, talking about high-rise buildings, high-rise residential buildings. So it is that understanding of what the impact of that one small change can be, going back to the fire strategy design, looking at the additional smoke ventilation systems, etc., that may be hanging on the back of that and re-reviewing it. Yeah, I welcome that, absolutely. As a designer, we welcome that. So that the fire strategy as a whole is implemented for the safety of people in that building. And that's what we should focus on. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we've had such fun already with those topics. We appear to have slightly run over our time. Now, we still have quite a lot of questions that have been asked that we need to get through. So rather than keep you all online for a lot longer, what we'll do is we'll put out a briefing with those questions and answers together, and distribute the recording as well for everybody afterwards. But safe to say, thank you, Neil, Nick, James, for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us on the webinar, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.